The call came at 3:07 in the afternoon. I thought I was rushing to the hospital to save my husband, Graham. But when the nurse looked up and said, "His wife and son are already inside," my world stopped. Through the glass, I watched his young secretary hold a child calling him Dad. If he wanted our marriage to be a fraudulent contract, I would gladly write the final termination clause. My name is Peyton Hughes. I am 38 years old, and I am the managing director of Stone Arc Advisory, a highly specialized corporate restructuring firm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. In my world, companies come to me when they are bleeding out. I am the person they call to cut away what cannot be saved, strip out the dead weight, and salvage whatever value remains in the wreckage. My entire professional reputation is built on a foundation of ice. Clients pay my firm tens of millions of dollars precisely because I possess a cold head, lightning-fast reflexes, and an absolute, unwavering refusal to let human emotion pollute my strategic judgment. I do not feel, I audit. I do not panic. I calculate. It had been an agonizingly long day of negotiations for a hostile takeover defense. I was sitting at the head of a polished mahogany table, dissecting a term sheet, when my phone vibrated against the wood. The screen displayed a call from St. Alder Medical Center. I excused myself, expecting a question about a board member's charity donation. Instead, a clinical, detached voice informed me that my husband, Graham Mercer, the chief executive officer of Crosshaven Freight Systems, had just been pulled from the wreckage of a severe car accident on Interstate 85. I did not delegate the response. I did not finish the meeting. For the first time in over 10 years, the armor cracked. I canceled my entire afternoon schedule with a single wave of my hand, left a room full of bewildered executives, and sprinted to the parking garage. The drive across the city was a chaotic blur of swerving between lanes, gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, and bargaining with a god I rarely spoke to. It was a rare, suffocating panic, a raw, jagged fear that I had violently suppressed for years. Graham was my anchor. While I fought relentless wars in boardrooms, he was my quiet, stable harbor. The thought of his chest crushed against a steering wheel, the thought of losing my husband, was the only thing capable of breaking me. I abandoned my car in the emergency drop-off zone, tossing the keys to a startled valet, and practically ran through the sliding glass doors of the trauma center. My designer heels clicked frantically against the sterile, heavily buffed linoleum. The air smelled of sharp antiseptic, iron, and burnt coffee. I reached the triage desk, my chest heaving, and slapped my driver's license onto the counter. "Graham Mercer," I demanded, struggling to keep the tremor out of my voice. He was brought in from a wreck on the interstate. I am his wife. The triage nurse, a heavy-set woman with deeply tired eyes, picked up my license. She typed his name into her computer terminal. I watched her eyes track across the glowing screen, and then I saw her brow furrow. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed her face. She looked at the screen, then looked back at me, then down at my identification again. "I am sorry, ma'am," the nurse said, her voice dropping to a hesitant, "protective register. But the patient's wife and son went in about 20 minutes ago. They are already inside. Are you perhaps his sister?" The words hung in the air, disjointed and entirely nonsensical. I died right there, standing perfectly upright in the middle of the brightly lit hospital corridor. My lungs simply forgot the mechanical process of pulling in oxygen. The frantic, terrified drumbeat of my heart flatlined into a strange, hollow echo. "There must be a mix-up with the files," I said, my voice eerily calm, stripped of all the panic from just moments before. "I am Peyton Hughes. Graham Mercer is my husband. We do not have a son." The nurse shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away from mine. She pointed a pen down the long, white hallway to our left. "He is in trauma room 4, ma'am. You can speak to the attending physician." I did not run. I walked. Every step felt like wading through wet, hardening concrete. The ambient noise of the emergency room, the beeping monitors, the rushing orderlies, the distant sirens faded into a muffled hum. I approached trauma room 4. The heavy wooden door was cracked open, offering a clear line of sight through the rectangular viewing glass. I stopped just outside the doorframe, hiding myself in the blind spot of the hallway, and looked inside. It was not a clerical error. Lying on the hospital bed, hooked up to an array of monitors with a thick bandage wrapped around his forehead and a brace securing his neck, was Graham, sitting right beside the bed, her fingers tightly, intimately interlaced with his. Was Aubrey Sloan. Aubrey was Graham's executive secretary. She was 26 years old, well over 10 years younger than me. She possessed soft features, wide eyes, and an eager-to-please, subservient demeanor that I had always dismissed as harmlessly naive during company galas. But she was not acting like a secretary bringing files to a boss. She was weeping softly, pressing his hand to her cheek. Worse, sitting on the edge of the stiff hospital mattress, swinging his legs in light-up sneakers, was a little boy. He looked to be about 4 years old. He had curly brown hair. As I watched, paralyzed, the boy leaned forward, gently patted Graham's uninjured arm, and spoke in a clear, high-pitched voice. "Wake up, Daddy. You have to wake up. A physical blow, a shattered rib, or a punctured lung would have hurt considerably less. But the true horror, the specific detail that plunged my core temperature to absolute zero and froze the blood in my veins, was standing on the other side of the hospital bed. Diane and Walter Mercer, my in-laws. They were not gasping in shock. They were not demanding to know why their son's young secretary was playing house in a trauma room. They were not looking around for me. Diane was standing right behind Aubrey, gently rubbing the younger woman's shoulders, murmuring something soft and comforting into her ear. Walter, the stoic patriarch, was leaning over to adjust the little boy's jacket, offering him a warm, reassuring grandfatherly smile. They were hovering around Aubrey and the child, wrapping them in a protective cocoon, treating her exactly the way a family treats a beloved legitimate daughter-in-law during a terrible crisis. They knew. They all knew. The typical, expected reaction of a betrayed wife in this scenario is noise. It is a loud, messy, theatrical explosion. It is bursting through the door, screaming, throwing bags, demanding answers, crying hysterically, and shattering the sickening domestic tableau into a million pieces. I felt the surge of that primal, violent wave of nausea and rage building in the back of my throat. But I did not storm in. I did not make a single sound. Instead, I took exactly one step back, and in that single, deliberate, silent step backward, Peyton Hughes, the devastated, grieving wife, vanished entirely. The managing director of Stone Arc Advisory stepped forward and took absolute control. Eyes. The professional instinct, honed by thousands of hours of hunting down hidden corporate fraud, piercing shell companies, and destroying liars in boardrooms, utterly crushed the personal agony. My mind snapped into a chilling, crystalline clarity. I assessed the room not as a broken heart, but as an auditor viewing a crime scene. This was not a drunken, regrettable mistake made after a late-night conference. This was not a brief lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis fling. A 4-year-old child meant a gestation period and a history spanning at least 5 years. The comfortable, normalized presence of his parents meant full family integration and systemic complicity. The triage nurse having Aubrey listed as the wife meant falsified paperwork, formal emergency designations, and long-term, calculated premeditation. If the hospital protocols, the emergency contact systems, and Graham's own parents were operating smoothly on an entirely different version of reality, then this was not a moment of weakness. It was a highly organized system of deceit. Graham had been running a dual ledger operation. He was operating 2 sets of books on his life. I stood completely alone in the hallway, letting the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights wash over me. I turned my head slightly and looked at my own reflection in the viewing glass of the emergency room door. My face was pale, drawn, but completely composed. My eyes were completely dry. The woman staring back at me was no longer a spouse navigating a marital crisis. I realized in that freezing, silent moment that my marriage had just transitioned from a private life into a corporate liability. A massive fraud case, and an incident requiring a ruthless, methodical investigation. Graham Mercer thought he had built a foolproof secondary enterprise. He forgot who he was married to. If he had turned our life into a fraudulent contract, I was going to be the one who wrote the final, ruinous termination clause. I stepped away from the viewing glass and walked down the corridor until I found an empty public restroom. I pushed the heavy wooden door open and locked it behind me. The space was quiet, smelling of bleach and synthetic lavender. I walked over to the row of sinks, gripped the cold porcelain edge, and stared at my reflection. My hands were shaking. It was a violent, uncontrollable tremor vibrating up through my wrists into my shoulders. I turned on the cold water, ran my hands under the freezing stream, and forced myself to take a slow, deep breath, then another. I stayed there until the shaking entirely subsided. Secrecy was my only advantage now. I would absolutely not give Graham the satisfaction of my devastation. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I strictly reserved for corporate emergencies. Cal Voss answered on the second ring. Cal was a former federal financial investigator who had transitioned to private practice. He was the man my firm called to untangle the most sophisticated, deeply buried accounting frauds in the country. He was brilliant, legally ruthless, and incredibly discreet. "Peyton," Cal said, his voice raspy but alert. "It is past 3 in the afternoon. Please tell me you are not calling to ask for a forensic audit on the manufacturing merger. I need you to work tonight." "Cal," I said, my voice completely flat, stripped of all emotion. "This is not for Stone Arc. This is personal, and it is completely off the books." The line went silent for a moment. Cal knew my boundaries. I never mixed my personal life with his services. "Tell me what you need." "I have 3 immediate tasks," I instructed, staring at the blank-tiled wall. "First, I need a comprehensive background check on a woman named Aubrey Sloan. She is an executive secretary at Crosshaven Freight Systems. I want everything: addresses, financial history, known associates. Second, I need you to quietly trace any hidden assets, shell companies, or secondary accounts linked to my husband, Graham Mercer. Look for recent, unexplained liquidities. Third, and most importantly, I need you to check birth records, pediatric clinics, and preschool registrations in the greater metropolitan area. Look for a male child, approximately 4 years old, associated with Aubrey. I need to know if that child carries the surname Mercer on any official or unofficial document." "Understood," Cal replied smoothly, asking no unnecessary questions. "I will start pulling threads immediately. I will have a preliminary report for you before dawn." "Thank you," I said, and ended the call. I smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt, unlocked the door, and walked back down the hallway. My heels clicked with measured, confident authority. I was no longer the shattered woman who had sprinted into the trauma center. I was the legally recognized spouse, perfectly composed, stepping into a hospital room to care for her injured husband. I pushed the door to Trauma Room 4 wide open, ensuring I made enough noise to announce my arrival. I pasted a look of profound, breathless concern across my face. "Graham," I gasped, rushing toward the bed. I came as fast as I could. The traffic was an absolute nightmare. The physical reaction in the room was instantaneous. Graham, who had been resting his head near Aubrey just moments before, jolted violently. The heart rate monitor positioned above his bed, which had been chiming a slow, steady rhythm, suddenly spiked. The blips accelerated into a rapid, frantic staccato. The little color left in his face drained away completely. Aubrey scrambled backward, her chair scraping harshly against the linoleum. She dropped his hand instantly, her wide eyes darting between me and the exit like a trapped animal. Before Graham could even open his mouth, Diane Mercer physically stepped between me and Aubrey. Her hands fluttered nervously in the air. "Peyton, darling," Diane chirped, her voice pitched unnaturally high. "Thank heavens you are here. We were just so worried. We happened to be in the area when we got the call. And well, Aubrey here is just such a loyal assistant. She was on her way to deliver some critical company files to Graham right when the accident occurred. She graciously stayed to make sure he was all right until family arrived." It was a pathetic, structurally flawed lie. The kind of hastily constructed alibi that would collapse under the mildest cross-examination. I did not challenge it. I simply nodded, stepping around Diane to reach my husband's side. I poured a small cup of water from the plastic pitcher, adjusted his pillow with gentle, deliberate care, and leaned in. His skin was clammy. He smelled of sheer panic. "I am just so glad you are alive, sweetheart," I whispered, holding his terrified gaze. I then turned my attention to the foot of the bed. I tilted my head, putting on a bright, utterly harmless smile, and looked directly at the little boy hiding behind Aubrey's legs. "And who is this handsome young man?" I asked lightly. The air in the room grew so dense it was practically unbreathable. Walter Mercer cleared his throat loudly, staring fixedly at the ceiling. Aubrey swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she rested them on the boy's shoulders. "This is my cousin's child," Aubrey stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I was babysitting him today, when I heard about Mr. Mercer. I had no choice but to bring him along." "How sweet of you," I replied, my tone perfectly even, while the entire room collectively held its breath, fixated on maintaining this flimsy theatrical performance. My eyes were actively sweeping the environment. I was cataloging evidence. On the small, rolling bedside table next to Graham, tucked slightly behind a plastic basin, I spotted a bright yellow valet parking ticket. It was a secondary ticket. Next to it was a small, white paper bag from a local pediatric pharmacy. And then, the most damning piece of all, Graham's smartphone, resting face up on the edge of the table, suddenly vibrated with an incoming notification. The screen illuminated for exactly 5 seconds. The lock screen background was not a picture of us. It was a high-resolution photograph of the little boy, sitting triumphantly on Graham's shoulders, both of them laughing in a sunlit park. I did not lunge for the phone. I simply recorded every single detail in my mind, locking them into a mental framework, exactly like a litigator silently building an unbreakable chain of evidence during a deposition. I would not win this war by screaming in a hospital room. I would win it on paper. "I need to go speak with the nursing station and sign the formal admission paperwork," I announced, giving Graham's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I will be right back. Darling Aubrey, thank you so much for bringing those files. You can go home now. Family is here." I turned and walked out of the room, feeling their collective sigh of relief hitting my back. They actually believed they had gotten away with it. I approached the central nursing station and requested Graham's chart. The clerk handed over the electronic tablet to sign the insurance and liability waivers. I scrolled through the digital forms, my eyes scanning the standard medical jargon. Then, I reached the bottom of the second page, under the section clearly labeled Emergency Contact and Primary Spouse. My name had been deleted. In its place, typed in stark, black digital ink, was the name Aubrey Sloan. I looked at the date of the modification listed next to the entry. The change had not been made today in a moment of panic. It had been officially processed exactly 2 months ago. A cold, sharp shiver traced its way down my spine. I signed the tablet with a steady hand and smiled. Let them think they were safe. I did not sleep. I did not even bother to turn on the main lights in the house we had shared for over a decade. I walked straight into my ground floor study, firmly shut the heavy oak doors, and locked myself inside. The silence of the empty house was absolute, broken only by the low, steady hum of my primary workstation booting up. I poured a glass of cold water, placed it carefully on the edge of the mahogany desk, and sat down in my leather chair. My mind was no longer processing the emotional devastation of a ruined marriage. I was now operating entirely within the clinical, unforgiving parameters of a forensic audit. For the next several hours, I meticulously cross-referenced our joint bank accounts, Graham's old travel itineraries, his past email archives, and the personal expense reports that had occasionally made me pause over the years. I had always dismissed those minor discrepancies as the chaotic byproduct of running a massive logistics network. I now understood they were the structural framework of a parallel existence. At exactly 2 a.m, a secure, encrypted message from Cal Voss materialized in my inbox. I clicked the attachment, bypassing the password protocol we had established years ago. Cal was a ghost in the digital world, and his preliminary findings hit my screen with the blunt force of a physical strike. Aubrey Sloan was not merely drawing a generous executive assistant salary. The documents Cal provided revealed she was the sole leaseholder of a luxury, long-term rental townhouse located in the highly affluent Dilworth neighborhood. The lease agreement outlined a monthly rent of $6,500. Aubrey was 26 years old and had zero personal wealth or credit history to secure such a property independently. Cal had traced the source of the rental payments. Every single month. The exact amount was wired from a nebulous, third-party consulting vendor contracted by Crosshaven Freight Systems. My husband was using his own company's operating capital to finance his mistress's premium real estate, but the second file Cal transmitted carried a much heavier, far more permanent weight. He had quietly traced the child through preschool enrollment records and pediatric intake paperwork. The little boy I had seen in the trauma center was registered legally as Milo Sloan. However, the intake forms for a private preschool academy and a boutique pediatric clinic in South Park told a drastically different story. On the emergency authorization forms and the financial guarantor agreements, the unofficial guardian was boldly signed in familiar, Looping Inc. It was Graham. He had physically signed the documents, binding himself financially and medically to the child, openly claiming a paternal role on paper while legally maintaining his childless marriage to me. Cal had not stopped there. He possessed the terrifying ability to follow a single dollar through a labyrinth of corporate shell games. He mapped out the entire subterranean cash flow. Every 30 days, Crosshaven Freight Systems initiated a wire transfer for strategic logistical consulting to an entity named Sable Oak Solutions. Cal pulled the state registry filings for the vendor. Sable Oak Solutions was a hollow shell company, an absolute phantom entity registered to a single managing director, Aubrey Sloan's older brother. The money did not stay with the brother. The ledger showed the funds passing through Sable Oak Solutions and immediately dispersing into 3 distinct channels. The first channel covered the Dilworth townhouse rent. The second channel paid for a premium, gold-tier family health insurance policy covering both Aubrey and Milo. The third channel trickled into a private, high-yield college tuition fund set up exclusively for the boy. Graham had built an entirely self-sustaining financial ecosystem, a perfectly insulated pipeline of embezzled corporate funds, solely to nurture and protect his second family. The sheer audacity of the embezzlement forced me to dig even deeper into Crosshaven's internal debt schedules. As a founding equity partner and a sitting board member, I possessed the highest level of administrative clearance. I bypassed the standard executive dashboards and dove directly into the raw, unfiltered capital expenditure logs. I was looking for the structural damage, the hidden liabilities that Graham might have buried to cover his tracks. What I found buried in the mezzanine debt portfolio was a betrayal so profound it completely eclipsed the infidelity. It was a mezzanine loan agreement tied to a highly speculative, fully automated warehousing project in the Midwest, a project I knew for a fact was currently hemorrhaging cash. The principal amount of the loan was $4.8 million. The lender was an aggressive, Tier 2 private equity firm known for ruthless collection tactics. Crosshaven's corporate credit alone was not strong enough to secure the capital for such a toxic asset. I scrolled down to the final page of the PDF, my eyes scanning the signature blocks. Graham's signature was there, authorizing the corporate borrowing. But right below his name, acting as the ultimate safety net for the private equity firm, was a section for a personal, unconditional guarantor. My name was typed on the line, and right above it was my verified digital signature. I stopped breathing. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, as the true magnitude of his crime materialized. I pulled up my personal travel calendar and cross-referenced the exact timestamp of the digital signature execution. The document had been electronically signed and notarized on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. On that specific Tuesday, I was standing behind a podium in London, delivering a keynote address on corporate restructuring, with my laptop securely locked in a hotel safe thousands of miles away. I had never seen that document. I had never authorized that guarantee. Graham had stolen my private security token, forged my digital signature, and quietly chained me to a $4.8 million sinking ship. He had essentially weaponized my pristine credit and my personal wealth to artificially inflate his failing projects, ensuring that if his house of cards collapsed, I would be the one buried under the rubble. Just as I was processing the criminal magnitude of the forgery, my laptop chimed softly. One final email arrived from Cal. The subject line was blank. I opened the attached image file. It was a high-resolution still frame, illegally pulled from a private, gated community security camera overlooking a neighborhood clubhouse patio. The timestamp on the image was from 3 months ago. It was a child's birthday party. The banner hanging in the background read, "Happy 4th birthday, Milo." Standing in the center of the frame, bathed in warm afternoon sunlight, was a picture of perfect domestic bliss. Aubrey was wearing a simple summer dress, holding a brightly frosted cake. Graham was standing right beside her, his arm wrapped casually and intimately around her waist, laughing at something out of frame, and standing perfectly positioned on Graham's other side, clapping their hands and looking at the child with absolute, undisguised adoration, were Walter and Diane Mercer. They looked whole. They looked happy. They looked exactly like a complete, functioning family celebrating the 3rd birthday of their beloved grandson. I sat in the cold, quiet darkness of my study and stared at the photograph. I understood then that Graham had not simply strayed. He had not merely sought out physical comfort in a moment of weakness. He had actively, methodically, and ruthlessly cannibalized my life to feed his own. He had used my professional reputation to secure his loans, my capital to build his safety nets, and my blind trust to fund an entire universe where I did not exist. I turned on the small desktop printer. I selected the final page of the forged $4.8 million loan guarantee and hit print. The machine whirred to life, spitting out the warm sheet of paper. I then selected the intercepted photograph of Milo's 3rd birthday party and printed that as well. I took the 2 pages and laid them side by side on the smooth, polished surface of my mahogany desk. I stood over them, looking down at the ink and the pixels. The room was absolutely silent. I did not shed a single tear. I felt nothing but a terrifying, absolute clarity. There, resting quietly on the same flat surface, were the 2 most agonizing truths of my existence: a deeply betrayed heart and a massively stolen fortune. I knew exactly what would transpire if I walked into that sterile hospital room the next morning and threw the printed evidence onto his lap. It would be a fatal strategic error. Graham was a survivor, a corporate animal who thrived on aggressive crisis management. If I confronted him prematurely, driven by righteous anger, he would immediately initiate a scorched earth protocol. He would use his executive access to wipe the servers, shred the shell company ledgers, and deploy his parents to run interference, painting me as a hysterical woman jumping to paranoid conclusions. Aubrey would be entirely discarded. He would frame her as a rogue, manipulative employee who embezzled funds without his knowledge, perhaps even claiming she was obsessed with him. I could not allow him to control the narrative or the timeline. I needed absolute leverage before I lit the match. I needed the keys to the castle, and I needed him to hand them to me willingly. My leverage was not merely marital, it was institutional. I was not just a spouse holding a joint checking account. I was a founding architect of Crosshaven. I had injected the crucial capital during their seed round over a decade ago, and I held a highly influential voting seat on the board of directors. By 8 o'clock the following morning, I walked into Graham's private hospital suite carrying a sleek leather portfolio. He was awake, looking groggy from the pain medication, but highly alert to his surroundings. His eyes tracked me carefully as I approached the bed. I presented a document drafted overnight by my own independent legal counsel. It was a temporary operating authorization. "Graham," I said, keeping my voice gentle, practically a whisper, channeling every ounce of fake anxiety I could muster. "The board is terrified. The lenders are getting incredibly anxious about the lack of leadership while you recover. You need to rest, but the market will not wait for your ribs to heal. I need you to sign this so I can step in, interface with the creditors, and keep the ship completely steady until you are back on your feet." He did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. His massive ego and his absolute terror of losing his corporate empire completely blinded him to the trap. He desperately needed to protect his primary source of wealth and power. He took the pen from my hand and signed his name, effectively signing away his executive privilege. With that single stroke of ink, he granted me full, unfettered access to the chief financial officer, the lending consortiums, and every operational file buried deep within the company network. The moment the ink was dry, I left the hospital and drove straight to the Crosshaven corporate headquarters. I bypassed his massive corner office entirely and walked directly into the basement server hub of the IT department. As acting executive authority, I issued a company-wide legal hold. I ordered the lead systems architect to instantly freeze all automated email deletion protocols, mirror every server to an off-site, secure location, and strictly lock the editing permissions on all digital signature logs. The tech team looked bewildered, but they complied immediately. I drafted a company-wide memo framing these aggressive actions as mandatory. Standard governance procedures triggered automatically by the chief executive's severe medical incapacitation. The genius of the move was how utterly boring and bureaucratic it sounded. When Diane Mercer called me later that afternoon, she was practically weeping with gratitude. She praised my endless dedication, thoroughly convinced that her brilliant daughter-in-law was merely working around the clock to protect her son's precious legacy. With the digital perimeter fully secured, I needed a human asset deep inside the accounting department. I scheduled a private, off-site meeting with Naomi Kerr, the chief financial officer. We met in a dimly lit, high-end steakhouse downtown, far away from the corporate campus. Naomi was sharp, cynical, and visibly carrying a tremendous amount of stress. Over a glass of sparkling water, I bypassed the standard corporate pleasantries. "Naomi, I know all about the unusual vendor disbursements," I stated clearly, keeping my eyes locked on hers. "I know you have flagged the consulting fees to Sable Oak Solutions multiple times, and I know Graham specifically told you to look the other way and process the wires." Her posture stiffened instantly. Her eyes widened in pure, unfiltered alarm, before she could mount a frantic defense or deny the allegations. I slid a single piece of thick paper across the polished wood table. It was a formal indemnification agreement, officially drafted by my firm, protecting her from any legal blowback, civil liability, or termination if she cooperated fully with my internal audit. "I am not here to shoot the messenger," I told her quietly, my tone radiating absolute authority. "But the music is about to stop playing, very soon. When the board finally sees the real ledgers, they will demand a scapegoat. Graham will hand them your head on a silver platter to save his own reputation. Work with me, provide every unedited spreadsheet, every raw data file, and I will ensure you walk away from this wreckage completely clean." Naomi stared at the contract for a long, heavy minute. She was calculating the odds, realizing that my offer was her only viable life raft. Then, she reached deep into her leather purse, pulled out a thick, encrypted flash drive, and placed it directly in my open palm. For the next several days, my life split into two completely isolated, parallel realities. By day, I executed the role of the flawless, fiercely devoted wife with terrifying perfection. I arrived at the hospital ward carrying insulated containers of artisanal organic soup, I sat in the uncomfortable vinyl chairs for hours, holding his hand, gently brushing his hair back, and translating the complex medical jargon from his surgical team into simple, reassuring terms for his parents. I managed the press releases with surgical precision, ensuring the business media reported only positive, uplifting updates regarding his rapid recovery. My performance was so seamless, so heavily saturated with authentic-seeming concern, that Graham visibly relaxed. His initial panic regarding my sudden arrival at the trauma center completely evaporated. He firmly believed he had successfully contained the blast radius. He believed I was entirely blind to the rot beneath our floorboards. But my internal compass was permanently locked onto a singular, freezing principle. I absolutely refused to let this become a pathetic story about a scorned, jealous woman throwing a deeply emotional tantrum. I would not wage this war with tears, screaming matches in the hallway, or throwing his expensive watches out the window. I would obliterate him with cold, hard metadata. I would crush his carefully constructed empire using authorized digital signatures, undeniable cash flow diagrams, and a mountain of forensic evidence that no highly paid defense attorney could ever successfully argue against in a court of law or before an angry, terrified board of directors. I returned to my dark, silent study at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The massive house was dead quiet, feeling more like a tomb than a home. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, the harsh blue light of the screen illuminating my face in the heavy shadows. I plugged in the flash drive Naomi had surrendered, feeling the weight of the data it contained. I navigated to my secure desktop environment and created a new, highly encrypted folder. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment, letting the reality of my impending strike wash over me. Then, I typed the name of the folder with slow, deliberate keystrokes: Mercer Exposure Timeline. Graham was officially discharged from the hospital a little over a week after the collision. He returned to our sprawling, custom-built estate in the affluent Myers Park neighborhood, looking physically battered but remarkably arrogant. He walked through the grand foyer, leaning heavily on a custom aluminum cane, surveying the pristine marble floors and the vaulted ceilings as if he were a weary king returning to his rightful, untouchable throne. He carried an air of quiet, absolute confidence, completely convinced that whatever minor domestic friction had occurred while he was sedated could now be handled privately, swept neatly under the thick, imported Persian rugs. He believed the crisis was entirely contained within the family unit. He had no idea the house he was stepping into was already a meticulously documented forensic crime scene. The enforced separation during his hospitalization had clearly fractured Aubrey's fragile sense of security, with Graham strictly confined to our marital home under my watchful, supposedly caring eye. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic and remarkably bold. The quiet, subservient executive secretary routine completely evaporated. She began calling his personal cell phone directly at 8 o'clock in the evening, refusing to use the secure, secondary communication channels they usually relied upon. When Graham would suddenly excuse himself to step out onto the back terrace, claiming he needed fresh air for his lungs, I knew he was frantically trying to pacify her. She bombarded him with text messages that vibrated violently against the mahogany nightstand, acting exactly like a woman who felt she possessed the ultimate, undeniable right to demand his immediate attention. Her desperation peaked when she physically appeared at the Crosshaven Freight Systems corporate headquarters. I was sitting in the executive boardroom, reviewing a risk assessment profile, when the head of corporate security sent a live encrypted feed link to my laptop. Aubrey had bypassed the standard vendor entrance and marched right up to the main reception desk in the grand lobby. She was carrying a thin manila folder, loudly claiming she was delivering highly sensitive, personal documents directly to the chief executive officer. I did not rush down to the lobby. I did not stage a dramatic, humiliating confrontation in front of the glass elevators. I simply instructed security to let her up to his temporarily empty office, all while quietly directing human resources and the front desk staff to officially log her entry and exit times. I allowed the high-definition security cameras to meticulously record her unauthorized presence, her frantic pacing, and her highly proprietary attitude in the executive suite. She was freely giving me the very evidence I needed to expose her, carefully recording her inappropriate access during the most legally sensitive phase of my internal corporate investigation. A few days later, Graham attempted to regain the psychological upper hand. We were sitting together in the formal living room. The large stone fireplace was casting a warm, highly deceptive glow across the expensive leather furniture. He poured himself a small glass of sparkling water, sighed heavily, and deployed a manipulative conversational tactic I had seen him use on hesitant investors for over 10 years. Surviving that wreckage really forced me to look back at my entire life. "Peyton," Graham said, his voice dropping into a soft, highly practiced register of deep vulnerability. "It makes you realize how fragile everything is. I want us to sit down, like the civilized adults we are, and really talk about rearranging our marriage. I want to fix the terrible distance between us." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, waiting for the inevitable. Calculating pivot. It did not take long. "But you have to admit, Peyton, you make it incredibly difficult sometimes," he continued, his tone subtly hardening, actively shifting the burden of guilt directly onto my shoulders. "You are always at the firm. You operate with such a chillingly cold efficiency. This house, this beautiful, massive estate we bought together, it feels like a curated museum, not a real home. I needed warmth. I needed a place where I was not just another operational line item on your daily itinerary." It was a masterclass in covert, refined humiliation. He was subtly justifying his massive betrayal, framing his elaborate, parasitic second life as a completely natural, biological reaction to my professional success and my supposedly icy demeanor. He was implicitly telling me that my ambition and my lack of traditional domestic softness had driven him directly into the arms of a younger, softer woman. I did not raise my voice. I did not furiously defend my character or loudly list the countless, exhausting sacrifices I had made to build his corporate empire. I simply looked at him and nodded slowly, committing every single poisoned word to memory. He honestly still believed he was the primary author of this narrative. He thought he could manipulate my guilt to secure a quiet, inexpensive forgiveness, while he sat in my living room complaining about the emotional temperature of our marriage. My private courier arrived at the side entrance of the house with a sealed, tamper-proof envelope. I excused myself, walked into my private study, and locked the heavy wooden door. It was the certified laboratory results. Cal Voss had managed to secure a discarded paper napkin used by the little boy during that chaotic afternoon in the hospital waiting area. I had quietly bagged the loose bristles from Graham's hairbrush and swabbed the rim of an unwashed water glass from his nightstand. The independent genetics laboratory had cross-referenced the samples. I ran my finger down the heavy cardstock until I reached the final conclusion block at the bottom of the page. The probability of biological paternity was officially confirmed at 99.9%. The elaborate web of lies, the fake cousins, the absurd, hastily constructed alibis, they were all instantly vaporized by absolute, undeniable scientific proof. The betrayal was no longer just a financial theory or suspicion. It was permanently encoded in blood. As I locked the DNA report in my secure, fireproof filing cabinet, my encrypted phone rang. It was Naomi Kerr, the chief financial officer. Her voice was incredibly thin, vibrating with genuine, unfiltered professional terror. "Peyton, we have a catastrophic problem," Naomi reported rapidly, not bothering with a greeting. "I just ran the final quarter projections using the raw operational data you unlocked for me. The operating cash fund is draining at an absolutely unprecedented rate. Those massive, recurring strategic consulting payouts to Sable Oak Solutions have completely bled our liquid reserves dry. If we do not inject fresh capital within the next 14 days, Crosshaven will officially breach the minimum liquidity covenant on our primary commercial debt facility. The lending consortium will have the absolute legal right to call the entire massive loan due immediately." Graham's desperate obsession with funding his hidden, Secondary domestic life was not just stealing personal wealth from me. It was actively, rapidly bankrupting the entire company. He was literally feeding his young mistress and his secret child with the essential lifeblood of the corporation, pushing a multi-million-dollar logistics empire right to the absolute edge of a catastrophic, unrecoverable default. That evening, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of our rotting marriage culminated in the formal dining room. The long mahogany table was set perfectly, adorned with crystal water glasses and heavy silver cutlery. Graham sat at the head of the table, cutting carefully into a piece of roasted chicken, continuing his soft, persuasive monologue about our shared future. He spoke endlessly about scheduling high-end couples therapy, about taking a long healing vacation to the Mediterranean coast, just the two of us, about wiping the slate entirely clean and learning to truly compromise. He was painting a beautiful, entirely fictional portrait of a beautifully repaired life. I sat to his right, silently sipping my red wine, my face an impenetrable mask of polite, calm attention. He rested his left hand casually on the table, his fingers lightly brushing against his expensive smartphone, right as he looked me in the eye and solemnly promised that he was finally ready to be the loyal husband I truly deserved. The screen of his phone illuminated the polished wood. A notification banner slid silently across the glass. The privacy settings masked the sender's actual name, but the preview text of the message was clearly, undeniably visible in stark black letters. Milo keeps asking when Daddy is coming back tonight. I looked down at the glowing screen. I looked up at the man eating his elegant dinner, completely oblivious to the digital bomb resting mere inches from his hand. I did not say a single word. I simply took another slow, deliberate sip of my wine, coldly savoring the absolute certainty that the man sitting across from me was already entirely destroyed, and he simply did not know it yet. I convened a strictly confidential, closed-door session of the Crosshaven Freight Systems Audit Committee on a Tuesday morning. I did not host it at the corporate headquarters where walls were thin and rumors spread like wildfire. Instead, I booked a soundproof, glass-walled conference room on the top floor of my own firm. The 3 senior board members arrived looking visibly tense, expecting a grim update on my husband's physical rehabilitation. They received a financial autopsy instead. I stood at the head of the dark walnut table and did not mention a mistress, a child, or a shattered marriage. I stayed entirely within the cold, formal language of corporate governance. I projected a heavily redacted presentation onto the wall monitor, summarizing the crisis into 3 unignorable administrative violations. "Gentlemen," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotional inflection, "I have uncovered severe operational anomalies that pose an existential threat to this corporation. We are looking at a forged digital executive signature on a $4.8 million mezzanine loan guarantee. We are looking at blatant, undocumented self-dealing routed through a hollow shell vendor named Sable Oak Solutions. And finally, we are facing an imminent risk of massive lender fraud exposure if these unauthorized capital drains trigger a liquidity covenant breach." The room plunged into a stunned, horrified silence. These were hardened corporate veterans, and the sheer audacity of the systemic breaches terrified them. I did not give them time to panic. I handed them a solution. I proposed an immediate non-negotiable emergency expenditure protocol, effective the exact second the meeting adjourned. Any corporate disbursement, wire transfer, or vendor payment exceeding $25,000 would strictly require dual executive authorization. The committee voted unanimously in favor. The mandate was instantly coded into the corporate banking portal. With one simple administrative rule, I effectively shut down the main cash channel financing Graham's second life. He could no longer unilaterally drain the treasury. My next maneuver was securing my own perimeter. I drafted a heavily armored legal notice and dispatched it via certified courier to the private equity consortium holding the compromised mezzanine debt. The letter formally notified their general counsel that my digital signature on the guarantor agreement exhibited undeniable digital forensic markers of being applied without my legal consent while I was physically out of the country. By formally declaring the signature highly contested, I legally paralyzed the bank. They were forced to halt any potential asset seizure or personal debt collection actions against my private accounts until a full, independent fraud verification could be concluded. My personal wealth was now securely locked behind a fortress of pending litigation. The shockwaves of my internal investigation rapidly reached the suburbs. The following afternoon, Diane and Walter Mercer arrived unannounced at my estate. They sat on my velvet sofa, their usual arrogant composure completely replaced by a frantic, poorly concealed desperation. They had heard whispers from loyalists inside the company about audits and frozen accounts. "Peyton, darling, you must tread carefully here," Diane pleaded, her hands wringing her expensive pearl necklace. "Graham has worked his entire life to build this company. We simply cannot have an aggressive internal witch hunt destroying the family reputation. Whatever minor accounting errors occurred, we should handle them quietly, internally, without dragging the board into a panic." Her plea accidentally revealed the exact depth of their complicity. They were not worried about accounting errors. They were terrified the investigation would uncover the shadow family they had been actively nurturing. I looked at my mother-in-law with an expression of deep, perfectly fabricated sympathy. "I completely agree, Diane," I said softly, sliding a single sheet of paper across the coffee table toward them. "That is precisely why I need to clear the immediate family of any suspicion. The board is thoroughly scrutinizing every vendor associated with Crosshaven. To protect you and Walter from the upcoming forensic sweep, my legal team prepared this simple affidavit. It just formally states that you have absolutely zero knowledge of a vendor called Sable Oak Solutions, and that you have never received any undisclosed financial support or compensation from Crosshaven outside of publicly filed dividends." Walter hesitated, his eyes darting toward the front door. But the sheer panic of being implicated in a corporate fraud scheme overpowered his caution. Desperate to maintain their facade of innocence and assume I was merely a blind, diligent executive trying to clean up a mess. They both signed the document. They handed the paper back to me, exhaling in relief, completely oblivious to the fact that I had a printed ledger sitting in my desk drawer. That ledger unequivocally proved Graham had utilized a secondary corporate slush fund to pay the monthly premiums on their premium life insurance policies and entirely clear their high-balance country club credit cards. By signing my document, my in-laws had just officially committed perjury in a corporate fraud investigation. Their final layer of legal protection was gone. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the invisible noose I had constructed finally snapped taut. The first of the month arrived, for the first time in 4 years. The automated wire transfer from Sable Oak Solutions did not hit the property management account for the luxury Dilworth townhouse. Aubrey Sloan received a very polite, highly terrifying notice of rental delinquency pinned to her front door. Her unshakable confidence, built entirely on Graham's stolen money, began to fracture. She realized, with a sudden, suffocating clarity, that the man who had promised her the world might no longer hold the keys to the vault. Graham discovered the newly erected financial walls 2 days later. He tried to initiate a quiet, emergency wire transfer from his home office to cover the bouncing townhouse rent. The banking portal blocked the transaction, flashing a bright red alert, demanding a secondary authorization token from the acting managing director. He stormed into my study, his face flushed with genuine, unrestrained fury. He slammed his aluminum cane against the doorframe. "What exactly gives you the right to freeze the primary operating accounts?" he demanded, dropping the gentle, recovering husband routine entirely. "I am the chief executive of this company. You are asphyxiating my vendors." I did not look up from my laptop. I kept my voice perfectly level, weaponizing the exact logic he had always used against me. "I am acting in my fiduciary capacity to protect the firm from a catastrophic liquidity crisis, Graham," I replied calmly. "The audit committee mandated the dual approval process because we discovered highly irregular capital drains. You authorized me to stabilize the ship while you recover. That is precisely what I'm doing." If your vendors are legitimate, simply submit the standard invoices for my secondary review. He stood frozen in the doorway. His jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. He could not argue against standard governance without exposing his own embezzlement. He turned and limped away, finally realizing that the cage doors were slowly swinging shut. But Graham Mercer was a cornered animal, and I knew I had to search deeper to find his ultimate exit strategy. Late that night, I bypassed the standard server logs and utilized the legal hold I had placed on his email archives to pull the highly encrypted, deleted metadata from his private executive outbox. I spent 4 hours decrypting a hidden chain of communications masked under a fake project code. When the plain text finally rendered on my screen, the sheer, breathtaking scope of his treachery became fully visible. He was not merely embezzling cash to fund Aubrey's lifestyle. He knew the company was heavily leveraged and dangerously close to a structural collapse. The emails revealed he was secretly negotiating a back-channel deal to sell the proprietary, core routing algorithm intellectual property of Crosshaven to a massive, hostile rival equity fund. He was planning to strip the absolute most valuable asset out of the company, pocket a massive, untraceable consulting payout offshore, and leave me, the board, and the lenders holding the empty, bankrupt shell of a corporation. He was preparing to light the match and walk away cleanly into a newly funded life. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of corporate chess. He did not know I had already taken the board. The atmosphere in the house had shifted from a tense waiting room to an active battleground. Graham, feeling the oxygen leaving his financial ecosystem, finally abandoned the pathetic charade of the repentant husband. The soft smiles and the manipulative promises of couples therapy vanished entirely. He summoned me to the formal dining room on a Thursday evening, dressed in a sharp-tailored suit despite his lingering injuries, projecting the aura of a man conducting a hostile termination. He placed a sleek black folder onto the polished mahogany table and slid it precisely toward me. "Peyton," he began, his voice dripping with condescending pragmatism, "this internal audit crusade of yours is destroying the company culture. It is clear that you are acting out of deep emotional distress regarding our personal issues. I think it is time we formally separate before you do permanent damage to the corporate structure." I opened the folder. It was a drafted separation agreement. The terms were spectacularly insulting. He was offering me a modest, 2-bedroom condominium in a mid-tier suburb, a single luxury sedan from our current fleet, and a one-time lump sum payment that he deemed sufficient for me to walk away quietly and rebuild my life. He was treating me like a mid-level executive he was forcing into early retirement. I read through the document slowly, keeping my face completely blank. I did not throw the papers at him. I did not raise my voice or point out that my initial seed capital had practically built his empire. I simply closed the folder and looked at him with hollow, silent eyes. Graham smiled a tight, victorious smile. He completely misinterpreted my silence. He looked at my stoic expression and saw a deeply wounded, heartbroken woman who was finally realizing she had lost the war. He genuinely believed I was paralyzed by the sheer, devastating reality of a divorce, confident that he had successfully neutralized me on the domestic front. Graham launched a covert offensive on the corporate side. Over the next 48 hours, he frantically dialed the minor equity partners and independent shareholders. He was aggressively gathering voting proxies, intending to call a sudden shareholder vote to forcefully remove me from the board of directors. His fabricated narrative was that I was an unstable, vengeful wife suffering a mental breakdown, completely blinded by a conflict of interest, and currently strangling the company out of pure, hysterical spite. He did not realize I had already cemented the floor beneath his feet. When he finally attempted to file the proxy motion with the corporate secretary on Monday morning, the request was immediately blocked. I had previously leveraged the chaos of his accident to invoke a strict standstill provision with our primary lending consortium, because the operating cash fund was critically close to a covenant breach. The lenders legally mandated that absolutely no changes could be made to the board of directors or the executive hierarchy until my comprehensive financial audit was formally concluded and verified by an independent third party. Graham was legally trapped in the very cage he had authorized me to build. That evening, I walked into his home office. The room smelled of expensive scotch and sheer panic. He was pacing furiously behind his desk, leaning heavily on his cane. "You locked the board," he hissed as I closed the heavy door behind me. I did not engage in a shouting match. I calmly walked over to his desk, reached into my blazer pocket, and withdrew a single, perfectly crisp piece of paper. It was not the entire deck of evidence. It was just one highly strategic card. I placed the printed copy of the $4.8 million mezzanine loan guarantee directly under his desk lamp. I tapped my index finger twice right next to my forged digital signature. "I am incredibly curious." "Graham," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper. "When the federal investigators inevitably subpoena the server logs, how exactly do you plan to explain applying my authorized digital signature to a multi-million-dollar corporate debt instrument while I was physically delivering a keynote address in London?" All the color instantly vanished from his face. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive disappeared, replaced by a terrified criminal staring at a felony conviction. He staggered backward, his eyes fixed on the forged document. His survival instinct, ruthless and entirely self-serving, immediately kicked in. He did not confess. He did not apologize. Instead, he instantly aimed the weapon at the woman he had claimed to love. "I never authorized that specific application," he stammered, his voice shaking. "Aubrey manages all the document routing and the digital execution logs. She has full administrative access. If that signature was applied incorrectly, the assistant manipulated the paperwork to cover up the vendor discrepancies. He was tossing the mother of his child directly into the fire to save his own skin." I left him trembling in his office. I already knew he would betray her. I just needed him to confirm it. It was time to systematically dismantle their alliance. Earlier that afternoon, I had employed a private courier to deliver a blank, untraceable manila envelope directly to Aubrey Sloane's desk. Inside the envelope was a heavily highlighted copy of the Sable Oak Solutions payment ledgers. I had specifically flagged the 3 distinct months over the past 2 years where her luxury townhouse rent, Milo's health insurance premiums, and his preschool tuition had inexplicably bounced or been delayed by several weeks. Right next to those delayed payments, I had attached the corresponding disbursement logs from a completely different corporate slush fund. The logs clearly showed that during those exact same weeks when Aubrey was desperately waiting for money to feed Graham's secret son, Graham was authorizing massive, expedited wire transfers to secure a premium, high-rise luxury loft downtown. The lease for that loft was signed by a regional sales director named Sarah, a woman Graham had heavily promoted right before she abruptly resigned a year ago. Aubrey had always believed she was the tragic, chosen soulmate, the true wife waiting in the shadows. The ledger proved she was nothing more than an operational expense, an item on a spreadsheet that occasionally had to be deferred to properly fund another woman's lavish lifestyle. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. The illusion of their grand, forbidden romance shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She was finally comprehending that she was not the exclusive exception to his marital vows, but rather just one active component in a highly organized system of consumption and concealment. Late that night, I stood in the absolute darkness of our sprawling, multi-car garage. I was leaning against the cold concrete wall, completely hidden in the shadows, when the heavy garage doors rolled open. Graham's car pulled in aggressively, the tires screeching against the polished floor. He threw the driver's side door open and stepped out into the dim light. He was clutching his phone to his ear, his face twisted in a mask of absolute, uncontrolled rage. "Listen to me," he snarled into the receiver, his voice echoing loudly off the concrete walls. "I do not care what anonymous garbage was sent to your desk. You need to stop acting like a lunatic and listen to my instructions. If you do not follow the plan exactly, they will throw both of us in prison." He slammed the car door shut, severing the call violently. I remained perfectly still in the darkness, listening to his uneven, angry footsteps recede into the house. I smiled. A cold, hollow expression in the pitch black. The impregnable fortress of their secret life was officially collapsing. The alliance had fractured, and the two of them were finally beginning to tear each other apart. The text message arrived on my secure line shortly after 8 o'clock in the morning. It was from a number I did not recognize, but the desperation in the syntax was unmistakable. Aubrey Sloan wanted to meet. She chose a small, poorly lit, independent coffee shop situated on the extreme industrial edge of the city, far from the polished corporate districts and the wealthy suburban enclaves we usually inhabited. When I walked through the glass door, the bell chimed weakly. Aubrey was already sitting in a corner booth. The arrogant, highly proprietary woman who had boldly marched into the corporate headquarters a week prior was entirely gone. She looked physically diminished. Her shoulders slumped forward, her face pale and devoid of makeup. She was nursing a cup of black coffee, her hands trembling so severely that the dark liquid threatened to spill over the ceramic rim. She was not here to gloat. She was here because she had finally realized the sheer, terrifying velocity of the bus. Graham was about to throw her under. I slid into the vinyl booth opposite her. I did not order anything. I simply looked at her, waiting for her to speak. "He is going to pin the entire vendor embezzlement on me," Aubrey whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her terror. "He told me to take the fall. He said if I confessed to manipulating the payment ledgers, he will pay for my legal defense and take care of Milo quietly. If I refuse, he threatened to show the board that my brother owns the shell company, and he will claim I orchestrated a massive corporate theft behind his back." I did not feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy. I did not berate her or call her a homewrecker. The reality was far too bleak for cheap, emotional melodrama. Instead, I unlatched my leather briefcase and withdrew 3 distinct, heavily organized manila folders. I placed them side by side on the scratched wooden table between us. "I am not here to insult you, Aubrey," I said, my tone as clinical and detached as if I were conducting a quarterly risk assessment. "I am here to show you exactly who you have been dealing with. Open the first folder." She hesitated, then flipped the cover open. Her eyes scanned the documents. "That is the preliminary escrow paperwork for a luxury waterfront condominium," I explained. "The purchase price is listed at $1,200,000. Graham promised you that he was securing this property for you and Milo to start a proper, permanent life together." Aubrey swallowed hard and nodded. "He said we were closing next month. Now open the second folder," I instructed. She did. Inside was a drafted deed of trust for a sprawling, custom-built mountain cabin in Asheville. "Graham commissioned those architectural plans 6 months ago," I continued, watching her expression fracture. "He explicitly promised that property to me as a grand, romantic gesture for our upcoming 10-year wedding anniversary. He told me it would be our private sanctuary." Before she could process the duplication, I tapped the third folder. "You do not need to open this one. I will summarize it. It outlines a massive, unauthorized executive retention package, including stock options and a premium downtown loft lease. He promised this package to a former regional sales director named Sarah, right before she suddenly resigned." Aubrey stared at the 3 folders, her breath catching in her throat. "All 3 of these grand promises," I said softly, driving the final nail into the coffin of her illusions, "were heavily dependent on the exact same, highly restricted commercial credit line, a credit line that is currently maxed out and facing imminent default. Graham did not just betray his marriage, he survived by aggressively selling the exact same, completely fabricated future to multiple women. He is running a romantic Ponzi scheme, Aubrey. The money does not exist. The future does not exist. You were never the chosen one. You were just the current investor." Aubrey broke, but the tears that spilled over her eyelashes and tracked down her pale cheeks were not the tears of a woman mourning a lost, passionate romance. They were the heavy, agonizing tears of absolute disillusionment. She wept because the terrifying reality had finally crushed her. She had actively participated in wrecking a marriage. She had compromised her entire moral foundation. And most devastatingly, she had dragged an innocent 4-year-old boy into a massive, structurally unsound web of lies built by a pathological corporate grifter. She had forced her son to call a mirage his father. She reached a shaking hand into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick padded envelope. She pushed it across the table toward me. "I kept everything," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, resolved whisper. "When he started missing the rent payments, I got scared. Inside that envelope is a prepaid cellular phone he strictly used for back-channel negotiations. There is a portable hard drive containing every single voice note he ever sent me, every deleted text message, and his private, unfiltered calendar schedules." I opened the envelope and looked at the cheap plastic phone and the silver drive. This was the holy grail of the investigation. This was the undeniable, physical proof that would bypass the corporate servers entirely. "There are audio recordings on that drive," Aubrey continued, wiping her eyes fiercely. "Recordings where he explicitly details his plan to use my brother's shell company to siphon the cash. He admits that he needs a disposable assistant to sign the vendor approvals so his own digital footprint remains clean." I closed the envelope and pulled it onto my lap. I looked directly into Aubrey's eyes, establishing a boundary that was carved in stone. "Listen to me very carefully," I stated, my voice radiating an absolute, unyielding authority. "I am going to take this evidence, and I am going to completely, systematically dismantle Graham Mercer. I am going to destroy his professional reputation. I am going to strip his equity, and I am going to hand him over to the federal authorities for fraud. But I will not use these weapons against a child." Aubrey stared at me, shock momentarily replacing her grief. "I will not attempt to legally claw back the embezzled funds that were directly utilized for Milo's pediatric health insurance, his preschool tuition, or his basic, essential welfare. I promised her. I am not a monster. I clearly separate a greedy, complicit adult from an entirely innocent 4-year-old boy. However, any future child support demands you make against his remaining personal estate must proceed through proper, fully transparent legal channels. You will never again use that child as leverage, and you will never again accept stolen corporate funds." "I understand," she choked out, nodding rapidly. "In exchange for this immunity regarding the child's past expenses," I concluded, "my legal counsel will draft a comprehensive, sworn affidavit detailing your exact involvement and Graham's direct instructions regarding the vendor fraud. You will sign it under penalty of perjury, if you cooperate. I will not include you as a primary defendant in my civil litigation." Aubrey, finally stripped of all her destructive illusions, agreed immediately. We did not shake hands. We did not offer each other false, comforting platitudes. We were not friends, and we never would be. But as we sat across from each other, surrounded by the smell of bitter coffee and old regrets, we shared a profound, chilling solidarity. We were simply two women who had finally opened our eyes and looked directly at the exact same monster. I left the coffee shop and drove straight to my secure office at Stone Arc Advisory. I locked the door, booted up my isolated forensic terminal, and plugged in the portable hard drive Aubrey had surrendered. I bypassed the personal, sickening voice notes of their affair and dug straight into the raw, unfiltered calendar exports and the saved document drafts. It took me less than 2 hours to uncover the final, apocalyptic layer of his betrayal. Deep within a hidden subfolder labeled under a fake logistics project, I found a confirmed, highly secretive calendar invitation. The meeting was scheduled for the upcoming Friday. The attendees included Graham and 3 senior managing partners from Northbriar Ventures. Northbriar was not just a rival equity fund, they were our most aggressive, cutthroat competitor in the national freight market. Attached to the calendar invite was a draft of an asset purchase agreement. Graham was not merely planning to sell the proprietary routing algorithms. The contract explicitly included the wholesale transfer of our entire, highly confidential client database and all the operational trade secrets of Crosshaven Freight Systems for a massive, 8-figure personal payout routed to an offshore account. My husband was preparing to completely hollow out the corporation from the inside. He was going to sell the heart, the lungs, and the brain of the company to our worst enemy, fully intending to leave me and the board of directors trapped inside the burning, empty shell. I structured the execution for one single, meticulously orchestrated Friday. It was a masterclass in compressed, inescapable corporate warfare. The timeline I built left absolutely no room for negotiation and zero oxygen for a counterattack. The morning was entirely dedicated to a special, mandatory session of the board of directors. Noon was locked in for an emergency, binding hearing with our primary lending consortium. The late afternoon was reserved for the final, catastrophic blow. I had my outside legal team standing by at the federal courthouse, ready to file an aggressive injunction to permanently freeze the intellectual property sale to Northbriar Ventures, immediately followed by a massive civil lawsuit against my husband for digital signature fraud and severe fiduciary breach. Every single hour of the day was a carefully planted explosive charge. To ensure he walked willingly into the blast radius, I had to feed Graham a very specific, highly comforting illusion. I intentionally allowed him to believe, through carefully leaked back-channel communications from my attorneys, that a quiet, private settlement was still on the table. I let him think that if he simply appeared at the board meeting, brought his operational files, and offered a minor concession, I would agree to a civilized divorce and step down from my executive role. I weaponized his own monumental arrogance against him. He genuinely believed he was charming enough to talk his way out of a federal crime. He thought he could stand before the board, flash his signature smile, and bully his emotionally shattered wife into a quiet retreat. The false promise of a peaceful resolution even lured Diane and Walter Mercer out of the suburbs. They arrived at the Crosshaven corporate headquarters just before 9 o'clock in the morning, intercepting me in the main glass corridor outside the executive suites. They brought a sickening mixture of desperate pleading and subtle, aristocratic pressure. Diane gripped my forearm, her heavy diamond rings pressing sharply into my skin. She leaned in close, suffocating me with the smell of her expensive floral perfume. "Peyton, darling, you are making the smart choice today," she whispered, her tone dripping with a highly practiced, fake maternal affection. "Swallow your pride and save this company. A messy public scandal would completely destroy the family reputation. We can all heal from this private tragedy if you just show a little grace and handle this internally." I did not pull my arm away from her grip. I simply looked at her, offering a cold, entirely vacant smile. I knew full well that by 5 o'clock that evening, the prestigious Mercer family reputation would be reduced to a pile of burning ash. I walked into the grand boardroom and bypassed the prominent seats near the center. I took the chair at the extreme far end of the long, polished mahogany table. I did not bring chaotic stacks of financial ledgers. I did not bring a team of whispering junior associates to shuffle papers for me. The space in front of me was terrifyingly minimalist. I placed my sleek silver laptop precisely in the center of my dark leather portfolio, right next to the computer. I positioned a small, black wireless projector remote. And finally, I laid out 3 thick, heavily sealed manila envelopes. Spacing them perfectly, symmetrically apart, I sat back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and radiated an absolute, chilling silence. The ambient atmosphere in the room was thick enough to choke on. The 7 independent board members, men and women who were mostly still blind to the catastrophic depths of the embezzlement, shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed leather chairs. They could physically sense the barometric pressure dropping. They knew something massive and highly destructive was about to detonate, even if they did not know the exact shape of the bomb. Adding heavily to the immense, suffocating tension was the presence of the senior legal counsel representing our primary mezzanine lenders. He sat squarely near the center of the table, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his face an unreadable, granite mask. His very presence completely annihilated Graham's desperate hope that he could spin this crisis as a simple, emotionally messy marital dispute, with the bank's lawyer sitting in the room. This was no longer a family argument. It was an official creditor tribunal. At exactly 9:15, the heavy double oak doors swung open. Graham made his grand, theatrical entrance. He had stubbornly discarded his aluminum cane, refusing to show the board even a single ounce of physical weakness or vulnerability. He wore an immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly styled, his posture radiating the confident, commanding aura of a visionary corporate founder stepping in to bravely calm a temporary storm. He walked straight to the head of the table, offering warm, reassuring nods to the senior board members as if he were simply arriving to deliver a standard quarterly earnings report. A brief moment later, Aubrey Sloane slipped quietly into the room. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, taking a small seat in the back corner normally reserved for the administrative staff taking meeting minutes. Graham briefly glanced at her, and a micro-expression of absolute, arrogant victory flashed across his handsome face. He truly believed she was there to support him. He thought she was playing the role of the loyal, terrified pawn, ready to absorb the entire blame for the vendor discrepancies exactly as he had instructed her to do. He was completely, blissfully oblivious to the fact that less than 12 hours ago, sitting in a dark, cheap coffee shop, she had handed me a sworn, notarized affidavit detailing every single one of his criminal directives. Graham cleared his throat, buttoned his expensive suit jacket, and began his performance. It was a masterfully rehearsed speech, deeply soaked in self-righteous indignation and corporate martyrdom. For 20 uninterrupted minutes, he commanded the room. He artfully painted the recent, terrifying financial irregularities as the tragic, unforeseen result of an overzealous, manipulative executive assistant who had maliciously taken advantage of his divided attention. He cast Aubrey as an opportunistic rogue employee who had exploited a blind spot in the accounting software. Then, he smoothly pivoted, subtly aiming his venom directly at me. He framed my aggressive internal audit as the hysterical, irrational retaliation of a jealous wife who could not separate her personal emotional trauma from her strict fiduciary duties. Finally, he blamed his horrific highway accident as the unfortunate catalyst that sparked a completely unnecessary, company-wide panic. He concluded his monologue by solemnly placing his hands flat on the polished mahogany, speaking with a practiced catch in his throat about the vital need for corporate stability, the immense personal sacrifices he had made as the original founder, and his unwavering, eternal dedication to protecting shareholder value. He finally finished speaking. A heavy, intensely expectant silence settled over the vast room. Every single head at the table slowly turned toward my end of the mahogany table. They were waiting for my frantic defense. They were waiting for me to argue, to raise my voice, to furiously deny his horrific allegations, or perhaps to break down crying under the immense pressure. I did none of those things. I let the absolute silence stretch for 5 long, agonizing seconds, allowing his toxic lies to hang suspended in the cold, sterile air of the boardroom. Then, I slowly unclasped my hands. I reached out and picked up the small black remote. I pressed the power button. High above our heads, the heavy, ceiling-mounted projector hummed to life. It cast a stark, blindingly bright square of pure white light against the presentation wall directly behind Graham. I slowly looked up, my eyes locking onto his with the dead, unblinking focus of an apex predator that had finally, permanently cornered its prey. I did not scream. I did not cry. I spoke exactly one sentence, my voice cutting through the silent room with the lethal, freezing precision of a surgical scalpel. Now, I will present the true timeline of this marriage, of this fraud, and of the man sitting at the head of the table. The first image that materialized on the stark white wall behind Graham was not a scandalous photograph or a stolen text message. It was a dense, highly technical spreadsheet displaying raw digital metadata. I directed my laser pointer to a specific line item highlighted in bright yellow, forcing every single eye in the room to focus on the numbers. "What you are looking at," I announced, my voice echoing clearly across the silent boardroom, is the verified digital forensic footprint of the $4.8 million mezzanine loan guarantee. You will notice the exact date and timestamp of the authorized digital signature execution. Right next to it is the originating Internet Protocol address. The signature was applied directly from the secure executive network right here inside the Crosshaven headquarters. I paused, letting the board members and the senior lender counsel lean forward, squinting at the undeniable data. On that exact date, at that exact time, I continued. I was standing on a stage in London, England. I have the flight manifests, the hotel receipts, and the conference video logs to prove my physical location. This is not a messy marital dispute over a forged personal check. This is highly calculated, premeditated federal wire fraud and severe identity theft. Graham's face drained of all color. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The lender counsel scribbled something furiously onto his yellow legal pad, his jaw tightly clenched. He knew instantly that his bank's guarantee was entirely fraudulent. But the deception was not simply limited to stealing corporate debt, I said, firmly clicking the remote. The slide shifted to a sterilized medical intake form. This is Graham's official hospital admission record from 2 months ago, long before his recent collision on the highway. Notice the specific section for the primary emergency contact and legally recognized spouse. My name was intentionally scrubbed from the hospital system. Aubrey Sloan was inserted in my place. A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled around the heavy mahogany table. I looked directly at the senior board members, holding their shocked gazes one by one. This was not a fleeting, regrettable mistake or a sudden lapse in judgment, I stated coldly. This was a fully operational, meticulously funded parallel life, and he funded it using your equity. I clicked the remote again. A massive, complex financial flowchart illuminated the room. It visually tracked the exact flow of the embezzled corporate capital. Every single month, Crosshaven authorized massive wire transfers to a phantom consulting vendor named Sable Oak Solutions, I explained, tracing the bright red lines on the screen with my pointer. From that illegal shell company, the money was quietly distributed into 3 distinct channels. The first channel paid the monthly rent on a luxury Dilworth townhouse occupied by his mistress. The second channel funded premium pediatric health insurance for his secret, 4-year-old son. I turned my gaze toward the back of the room, where Diane and Walter Mercer were sitting in the observer chairs. Their arrogant composure had completely shattered. Their faces were frozen in absolute, undeniable horror. The third channel, I revealed, letting the words hang heavily in the air, was quietly routed into a secondary slush fund used to pay off the Premium Country Club credit cards belonging to Diane and Walter Mercer. I reached into my portfolio, pulled out the sworn affidavits they had eagerly signed days earlier, and tossed them onto the center of the table. These are the legally binding documents his parents signed just last week, swearing under penalty of perjury that they had absolutely zero knowledge of Sable Oak Solutions and had never received undisclosed corporate funds. They lied to my face to protect a massive, ongoing embezzlement ring. Diane let out a choked, terrified sob, burying her face in her trembling hands. Walter looked like he was about to suffer a massive cardiac event, gripping the armrests of his chair until his knuckles turned entirely white. And finally, I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. The most recent capital drains were being secretly diverted into an offshore escrow account. Graham was actively finalizing a covert agreement to sell our proprietary routing algorithms and our entire confidential client database to Northbriar Ventures. He planned to completely strip the vital intellectual property of this corporation, pocket an 8-figure payout, and leave this board and these lenders holding a bankrupt, empty shell. The boardroom erupted. The senior partners began shouting over each other. The lender counsel slammed his expensive pen down on the table, loudly demanding immediate structural receivership. Graham, fully realizing the walls had completely collapsed and crushed him, jumped out of his chair. He pointed a trembling, desperate finger directly at Aubrey, who was sitting quietly in the corner. "She did it!" Graham screamed. his voice cracking with sheer, pathetic panic. Aubrey manipulated the vendor routing. She is a manipulative, rogue assistant who stole the funds behind my back. I had absolutely nothing to do with the shell company. I did not argue with him. I simply pressed the final button on my remote. The projector screen went completely black, and the high-fidelity audio system built into the ceiling crackled to life. It was a covert voice note, crystal clear, echoing Graham's own arrogant, callous voice across the chaotic room. "Peyton is financial security," my husband said on the recording with chilling casualness. "Aubrey is temporary cover. She is useful for now. If the audit committee starts digging, I will let a few people take the hit and walk away clean." The audio recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. Graham collapsed back into his leather chair, staring blankly at the polished wood table. He was entirely, fundamentally destroyed. Aubrey stood up from her chair in the corner. She did not cry. She looked directly at the stunned board members and spoke in a clear, fiercely steady voice. "I can verify every single detail of this presentation," Aubrey stated, holding her head high. "He explicitly instructed me to forge the vendor approvals. He promised me a significant equity stake in a new corporate structure. But he completely hid the massive mezzanine debt and the illegal vendor fraud from me. I have already provided a fully sworn, notarized affidavit to the internal investigation team detailing his exact criminal directives." The execution was swift and merciless. The board of directors did not even need to leave the room to formally deliberate. They held an emergency verbal vote right there at the table. It was entirely unanimous. Graham Mercer was officially terminated from his position as Chief Executive Officer for gross misconduct and severe fiduciary breach, permanently stripped of all executive privileges, and immediately escorted from the premises by corporate security. The Lender Council, fully recognizing that I was the only person standing between the bank and a total financial collapse, agreed to halt the immediate debt recall. He formally accepted my emergency restructuring proposal on one strict condition: I would retain my voting power and actively oversee the immediate transition to a completely independent, third-party interim chief executive. Before 3 o'clock that afternoon, my outside legal counsel officially filed the emergency injunction at the federal courthouse. The intellectual property sale to Northbriar Ventures was permanently blocked. Simultaneously, we filed a massive civil litigation suit against Graham for the digital signature forgery, severe fiduciary breach, and extensive self-dealing. He was now facing total financial ruin and a highly probable federal criminal prosecution. The collateral damage was equally absolute. Diane and Walter Mercer lost their final layer of aristocratic protection. During the financial unspooling, the forensic accountants discovered that they had foolishly used the equity in their massive suburban estate to legally co-sign and guarantee one of Graham's toxic private loans. The grand house they believed was completely safe instantly became a highly contested, seizable asset. They were going to lose everything they had built their arrogant identities upon. Aubrey lost her luxury townhouse, her executive role, and every single grand illusion she had harbored about her supposed soulmate. However, I kept my absolute promise. I petitioned the federal judge to legally carve out a strictly supervised, independent child support trust fund from the fractured remains of Graham's personal, legitimate assets. The money would be heavily monitored by a court-appointed guardian, ensuring that Milo would have his health insurance and tuition completely covered without Aubrey ever touching a single dime of it directly. I flatly refused to let an innocent child be punished for the disgusting sins of his parents. I walked out of the towering glass building just as the sun began to set. My phone was vibrating relentlessly in my coat pocket. The screen flashed with frantic incoming calls from aggressive business journalists, panicked defense attorneys, relieved banking syndicates, and hysterical members of the Mercer family begging for mercy. For the first time in over 10 years, I let the phone ring. I did not move to solve the crisis. I did not build an exit strategy for a man who had never truly loved me. I simply turned the phone off and slipped it into my pocket. I stepped down the wide granite stairs and took a long, deep breath of the crisp, late afternoon city air. It tasted like absolute, undeniable freedom. I looked back up at the towering glass windows of the boardroom one last time, realizing the profound truth of my victory. My revenge was never truly about destroying a man. It was simply about forcing every single mask he wore to fall to the floor at the exact same time, leaving him to finally stand in the terrifying, naked reality of his own making. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are listening from. So please leave a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Please remember to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.